Hey everyone, I'm your author June. Before we get started, I really would appreciate it if everyone could hit the subscribe button. It helps me grow the channel, and I would love for all of you to come on this journey with me, as a family. Now, let's get into the story. Let me know if you enjoy. The locomotive screeched to a halt, its brakes a metallic shriek that echoed through redemption. A plume of dust erupted, settling like a russet film on Elara's already weary traveling dress. She patted it down, a futile effort, and clung tighter to her time-worn satchel. Her other hand held the photograph, a faded portrait of a kind-faced man whose gentle smile felt like both a promise and a taunt. He was her legal anchor, a stranger binding her to this place. Stepping onto the wooden platform, the rough-hewn planks felt solid beneath her scuffed boots. The air was thick, a cloying mix of sun-baked earth and the tang of metal, a whisper of the nearby mines. The station itself was a dilapidated shed, dwarfed by the baking wood structures of Redemption proper. Conversations ceased, all eyes turned her way. The collective gaze felt like a physical weight, assessing and absolute. For a heartbeat, she was utterly isolated. From the knot of onlookers near the livery, a figure emerged. Sheriff Ben Holt moved with a quiet confidence, his broad frame encased in a dark, weathered coat. The star pinned to his chest caught a glint of sun. He was taller in person, his face a roadmap of hardship and tough calls. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held her captive with their intense, unreadable gaze. He stopped short, a few feet separating them, his posture rigid, his expression an unyielding mask. "Miss Rosewood?" His voice was a low rumble, utterly devoid of welcome. "Yes," Elara answered, her voice barely audible. She swallowed, fighting to regain her equilibrium. "Sheriff Holt." The silence that followed was taut, broken only by the train's settling groans and the distant cry of a crow. He offered no handshake, no welcoming smile. He was a stark barricade between her and whatever awaited her in Redemption. "Welcome to Redemption," he finally said, the words more a judgment than a greeting. He gestured toward a waiting buckboard. "Your belongings?" Elara indicated the satchel. "Just this. The rest should be on the train." A terse nod was his only reply. Then he turned toward a boy, perhaps 14, loitering nearby. "Ethan, see to Miss Rosewood's trunk." The boy practically leaped to obey, relief evident in his eagerness. Holt didn't acknowledge her as he moved to the buckboard, mounting it with an economy of motion. Elara hesitated, then followed, swinging herself up onto the cracked leather seat. The springs protested with a chorus of squeals. As they pulled away, Elara chanced a glance at the townspeople. Martha Abernathy, Redemption's self-proclaimed moral compass and repository of secrets, stood arms crossed, her gaze piercing. Beside her, Silas, the blacksmith, spat tobacco juice into the parched earth, his features unreadable. Every face was a canvas of curiosity and speculation. The ride crawled forward in near silence. Holt kept his focus glued to the dusty track, his jaw clenched tight, his hands avise on the reins. Elara stole covert glances, trying to decipher the man beneath the badge. He possessed a rugged handsomeness, yet his features were austere, hewn from granite. A profound weariness haunted his gaze, a somber shadow clinging to him like a second skin. The town presented a study in contrasts. A freshly constructed church stood in proud defiance next to a dilapidated saloon, its glory days long faded. The general store, its windows a vibrant collage of wares, stood in opposition to a cluster of decaying shacks. Life here, Elara surmised, was both precious and precarious. The bookboard halted before a small whitewashed house, its porch listing slightly. It was unpretentious but tidy, a small bloom of wildflowers in the front yard, offering a vibrant splash of color in the otherwise drab landscape. "This is it," Holt stated, his tone still devoid of inflection. "Town property. It's serviceable." Elara descended, her muscles protesting the long journey. She surveyed the house, then returned her gaze to Holt. "Thank you," she said, striving for warmth. "For everything." He offered no response, his stare narrowed, as if attempting to dissect her soul. "I'll have Ethan bring your trunk over." He paused, then added, with what seemed like reluctance, "Supper's at the Abernathys'. 6 o'clock. With that pronouncement, he wheeled the buckboard around, leaving Elara standing alone before her new abode, Dust Devils. Swirling around her ankles, she watched him depart, a prickle of disappointment settling in her chest. This was not the welcome she had envisioned, but she refused to be cowed. She'd come to redemption to carve out a life, and she wouldn't let a stoic sheriff and a distrustful town stand in her way. Drawing a steadying breath, she straightened her shoulders and approached the house. The front door groaned open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished space. It was humble, but it was hers. Placing her satchel on the small table, she retrieved the photograph. She studied the man's gentle countenance, his kind eyes offering silent encouragement. "I'm here," she whispered, resolve threading her voice. "And I'm not retreating." Later, as dusk descended and she made her way toward the Abernathy residence, Elara felt the unsettling sensation of being observed. Every shadow seemed to conceal watchful eyes, every breeze carried a hushed judgment. She drew her shawl tighter, attempting to quell the prickling unease on the back of her neck. The Abernathy house was larger and better maintained than the majority of homes in Redemption. Warm light spilled from the windows, and the savory aromas of dinner drifted into the cool air, a tempting invitation. Elara hesitated before knocking, a nervous flutter in her chest. Martha Abernathy herself answered, her face a mask of curiosity. "Elara, dear," she greeted, her tone surprisingly mild. Come in, come in. We were expecting you." Elara stepped inside, the warmth washing over her like a comforting embrace. The room teemed with people, all turning to scrutinize her arrival. Holt stood near the hearth, his expression unchanged. "Everyone," Martha announced, her voice carrying authority. "This is Elara Rosewood. She'll be residing with us for a time." A ripple of murmurs circulated the room, but Elara sensed an undercurrent of apprehension. She offered a polite smile, striving for composure despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Supper was a strained affair. Elara found herself positioned opposite Holt, their gazes rarely connecting. The conversation felt forced, punctuated by polite inquiries about her journey and intentions. She responded as best she could, projecting an image of competence and strength. Martha Abernathy, however, was not easily deceived. She watched Elara with knowing eyes, missing nothing. At one point, she leaned in and inquired, "So, Elara, what are your thoughts on our sheriff?" Elara's cheeks flushed. She glanced at Holt, whose countenance remained impassive. "He appears committed," she offered carefully. Martha chuckled. "Committed is one term for it. Obstinate is another. Ben's a decent man, but he harbors his own secrets. As we all do in this corner of the world." The words hung in the space, pregnant with unspoken meaning. Elara shifted uncomfortably. She had no desire to unearth Holt's secrets. She only sought to establish a life in Redemption, a place to call home. As the evening waned, a mounting weariness settled over Elara. The burden of travel, the townsfolk's intense scrutiny, and the impenetrable wall erected by Holt were taking a toll. As she prepared to depart, Holt finally addressed her directly. "I'll escort you home," he stated, his voice still toneless. Elara nodded, grateful for the gesture, however impersonal. As they stepped outside into the Stygian dark, the silence between them felt heavy and absolute. They walked without speaking until they reached the small house. Elara turned to face him, her pulse quickening. "Thank you," she repeated. "For the escort." He offered a curt nod. "Good night, Miss Rosewood." He pivoted to leave, but Elara felt compelled to speak. "Sheriff Holt," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "Why did you consent to this arrangement?" He froze, his back to her. He remained motionless for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. At last he turned, his face etched with a depth of sorrow she couldn't fathom. "It was my duty," he replied, his voice almost inaudible. "Nothing more." With that, he turned and melted into the darkness, leaving Elara standing alone once more, the weight of his words settling upon her like a shroud. The Long Anne's mask was firmly fixed, obscuring the man beneath, a man clearly tormented by his past. And Elara knew, with growing certainty, that unraveling that past would be the most formidable challenge she had ever encountered. A cold welcome the silence in the sheriff's office was thick enough to choke on. Elara watched Ben as he shuffled papers on his desk, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding hers. Dust motes danced in the single ray of afternoon sun that pierced through the grimy window, illuminating the lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. She'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that after the initial shock of her arrival, he might offer some semblance of welcome, some acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum required by courtesy. But nothing. Just the cold, hard wall he seemed determined to maintain. "So," she began, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the small space. "Redemption. It's certainly a name." She offered a small, tentative smile, hoping to chip away at the ice. Ben didn't look up. "It is." His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any inflection. Elara pressed on, determined not to be deterred. "Mr. Abernathy, the man in the photograph, did he like it here?" He finally met her gaze, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. "He did what he had to do." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was something. A crack, however small, in his armor. "And what is it that you have to do, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with genuine curiosity. The question seemed to startle him. He looked away again, his gaze fixed on the faded wanted poster tacked to the wall. "Keep the peace," he said, the words clipped and precise. "That's all." Elara wasn't convinced. There was something else there, something lurking beneath the surface, a darkness that clung to him like the dust to the corners of the room. She could feel it, a palpable weight in the air. "Is it a difficult task?" she persisted, choosing her words carefully. "Keeping the peace, I mean." "Sometimes," he conceded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it's like trying to hold back a flood with a sieve." "And what floods are you holding back, Sheriff?" This time, his response was immediate and sharp. "That's none of your concern, Mrs. Holt." The use of her married name felt like a brand, a harsh reminder of the strange, forced union they were now bound by. Elara recoiled slightly, the chill in his voice cutting through her. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, but the sheer force of his rejection was more than she'd anticipated. She'd arrived in redemption with a sliver of hope, a fragile belief that she could build something here, that she could find a place for herself in this strange, unwelcoming town. But the man she'd married, the man who was supposed to be her partner, Her protector seemed determined to crush that hope before it had a chance to blossom. She stood up, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I understand," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I won't bother you any further." As she turned to leave, a new voice cut through the silence. "Sheriff, don't you think that's a mite unkind?" Martha Abernathy stood in the doorway, her presence a comforting balm in the tense atmosphere. Her kind eyes, the color of warm honey, were fixed on Ben, her expression a mixture of disapproval and concern. She held a basket laden with what looked like freshly baked bread and a small posy of wildflowers. Ben sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Martha, I'm busy." "Busy being inhospitable, you mean," Martha retorted, stepping into the office. She placed the basket on a nearby table, the scent of warm bread filling the air. "The least you could do is offer the poor woman a place to rest her head. She can find a room at the hotel," Ben said, his voice flat. "The hotel is overpriced and undercleaned," Martha countered. "Besides, I have a room at my boarding house that's just begging to be filled. Wouldn't you agree, Elara?" Elara turned to Martha, grateful for the lifeline she was offering. "I would be very grateful for a room, Mrs. Abernathy." "Martha, dear," she corrected, her smile warm and genuine. "And don't you worry about a thing. I have a feeling you and I are going to get along just fine." She turned back to Ben, her expression hardening slightly. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Ben Holt, treating your wife like a stray dog you found on the side of the road." Ben flinched, the words hitting their mark. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Come along, Elara," Martha said, taking her arm. "Let's get you settled in. And don't pay any mind to our grumpy sheriff here. He has a heart of gold, buried somewhere under all that dust and regret." As they walked out of the office, Elara glanced back at Ben. He was still standing there, his shoulders slumped, his expression unreadable. She wondered what secrets he was hiding, what demons he was fighting. And she wondered if she would ever be able to break through the wall he had built around himself, or if she was destined to spend her life in redemption a stranger to the man she had married. Martha's boarding house was a haven of warmth and light, a stark contrast to the cold austerity of the sheriff's office. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of cinnamon and lavender, and the walls were adorned with colorful quilts and framed photographs. It felt like stepping into a different world, a world where kindness and compassion still held sway. "Here we are, dear," Martha said, leading her up a creaking staircase. "Room number 3. It's not fancy, but it's clean and comfortable, and the view of the mountains is quite spectacular." The room was small but cozy, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and a vase of freshly cut flowers on the windowsill. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It wasn't home, but it was a start. "Thank you, Martha," Elara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "This is perfect." "Nonsense," Martha said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just a room. But it's yours, for as long as you need it. And don't you hesitate to ask if you need anything at all. I may be an old woman, but I still have a few tricks up my sleeve." Elara smiled, feeling a flicker of hope rekindle within her. "I appreciate that, Martha, more than you know." "Now, why don't you freshen up a bit?" Martha said. "And then come down for supper. I'm making my famous chicken pot pie. It's guaranteed to warm you from the inside out." As Martha left, Elara closed the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. Redemption. It was a town steeped in secrets and shadowed by the past. And she, Elara Rosewood Holt, was now inextricably bound to it. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't give up without a fight. She would find her place in this town, even if it meant chipping away at the heart of the man who didn't want her there. Even if it meant uncovering secrets that were better left buried, she would find her redemption, one way or another. Ghosts of the past, the porch swings creak was a mournful clock, each sway marking another sleepless second for Ben. Since Elara's arrival, true rest had eluded him. She was a constant, if subtle, reminder of his losses, of the vows he'd failed to keep. He gazed at redemption's slumbering Main Street, the buildings' facades cloaked in shadow under the star-pricked sky, each a silent judge of his inadequacy. He squeezed his eyes shut. The past surged forward, unwelcome and sharp. The air shimmered with the sugary perfume of mountain blooms, an oasis from redemption's usual dust-choked atmosphere. Then, untainted by the badge's burden, was filled with laughter. Just Ben Holt then, a rancher with sun-leathered hands and a heart overflowing with hope, his arm a firm circle around Sarah's waist. Hair, the color of ripened corn, spilled down her back as she looked up, her eyes bright with a joy that mirrored his own. "Guess what I spied by the creek today," she murmured, a playful lilt in her voice. Then pretended ignorance, drawing her closer. "Try me, darlin'. Doubt there's anything I can't guess when you're involved." "A bluebird," she breathed, her gaze incandescent. "But first this year. Mama always said they bring good fortune." He chuckled, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. "We don't need luck, Sarah. We have us." Their lips met, a kiss as gentle as the unfolding leaves, a pledge of forever sealed in the sun's golden warmth. A life in progress, carefully constructed, hope upon hope. A life stolen too early. The scene fractured, the meadow's sweetness replaced by the harsh bite of burnt powder. The merriment dissolved into screams. Sarah's name ripped from his throat in a hoarse, anguished bellow. 4 riders, masked and devoid of mercy, stormed into redemption, their identities concealed by bandanas, their intentions brutally clear: plunder and mayhem. Unprepared, Ben could only watch as they pillaged the bank, pistols blazing. Sarah, caught in their murderous trajectory, fell, a dark stain blossoming on her pristine dress. He recalled the metallic tang of blood, the ringing clamor of gunfire, the agonizing crawl as he reached her. He remembered cradling her broken form, her eyes wide and vacant, the bluebird's promise reduced to ash. "Bene," she gasped, her voice a fragile thread against the chaos. "Promise me. Promise you'll avenge them." The memory gnawed at him, a festering sore. He hadn't just lost Sarah. A piece of himself had died with her. The light-heartedness, the delight, the capacity for unconditional devotion. All vanished, snatched away by the marauders who had invaded his town and shattered his world. He squeezed his eyes tighter, striving to erase the image of her empty stare. He had made a vow that day, an oath etched in blood and despair. He would mete out justice to those who preyed on the weak, those who believed they could exist beyond the reach of the law. He would become redemption's bulwark, the blade that delivered vengeance. The vision shifted. Ben, standing before the town council, his face a rigid mask, his eyes like chips of flint. No longer the carefree rancher. He was a man remade in the crucible of loss, hardened by grief, propelled by a relentless trapper. Thirst for retribution. "I'll be your sheriff," he declared, his voice rough but unwavering. "I'll uphold the law. I'll defend this town with my life. But I'll do it my way." Ben blinked, the aftertaste of the memories bitter on his tongue. The starlight seemed less comforting, the shadows more profound. He knew why the townsfolk pressed him to remarry. They yearned for him to find peace, a shot at happiness. They desired to see a spark rekindled in his gaze, but they didn't understand the truth. He was damaged beyond repair, haunted by specters. He dragged a hand down his face. The rasp of stubble, a grounding sensation. Elara was a decent woman, that much was apparent. Strong, self-reliant, possessing a quiet fortitude that belied her delicate frame. She deserved a husband capable of furor, offering his whole heart, not a man shackled to his past. He knew he couldn't provide that. Not now, perhaps never. The soft complaint of a door opening sliced through his thoughts. He turned to find Elara silhouetted in the doorway, a shawl hugging her shoulders, her face washed pale by the moonlight. "Couldn't sleep?" she inquired, her voice gentle. He hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was too exposed, too raw to articulate. "Just thinking," he mumbled, his voice raspy. She didn't pry, but her eyes held an intuitive understanding. She saw deeper than he wished, more than he was comfortable revealing. "It's a beautiful night," she observed, stepping onto the porch. She leaned against the railing, her gaze lost in the distant horizon, then remained on the swing, his muscles coiled, his mind a maelstrom. He wanted to unburden himself, to tell her about Sarah, about the oath he'd sworn, about the darkness that threatened to consume him. But the words remained trapped, suffocated by years of silence and remorse. "Redemption is a lovely town," she continued, her voice barely audible. "It feels secure." The word hung between them, laden with irony. Secure. He had failed to shield Sarah. How could he promise Elara any different? He rose, his boots whispering against the wooden planks. He walked to the railing, standing beside her, close yet not touching. "It's my responsibility to keep it that way," he said, his voice a low rumble. She turned to face him, her eyes searching, probing. "And what about you, Ben? Who safeguards you?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. He had no answer. He was alone in his struggle, a lone sentinel guarding his domain, forever stalked by the ghosts of the past. He averted his gaze, unable to meet her. "Scrutiny. I don't need anyone to keep me safe," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "I just need to uphold the law." He turned and retreated into the house, leaving Elara alone on the porch, her figure outlined against the starry canvas. He knew he had wounded her, pushed her further away. But he couldn't allow her to get too close. He couldn't risk exposing her to the abyss within. He was a sheriff, a protector, a guardian. But he was also a prisoner of his own history, a man eternally bound by a vow forged in blood and sorrow. And some vows, he understood, were destined to be kept, even at the cost of his own contentment. Baking a new beginning sunbeams, attenuated by layers of prate, grime on the storefront windows, illuminated swirling particles within. Elara Rosewood scanned the space, exhaustion battling the fragile bloom of hope. The air carried the stale ghosts of past ventures, a whisper of cured leaves from the barber shop, a damp odor hinting at textiles and forgotten notions. It wasn't much, this shell of a building, but it was almost hers. "Well, darling, it's no palace," Martha Abernathy observed, her voice a gravelly rasp cultivated from years of boarding house management and unfiltered cigarettes. "But the foundation's solid, and redemption's thirsting for a bakery more than another watering hole." Martha nudged her spectacles higher, her sharp gaze cataloguing the flaking paint and splintered planks. "Hemmings will practically give it away, I suspect. He's been trying to unload it for ages." A small smile touched Elara's lips. "I'm grateful you spoke to him, Martha. I wouldn't have known where to begin." She rubbed at a persistent smudge on the counter's surface. "It requires substantial renovation." "Indeed," Martha affirmed, extracting a crumpled handkerchief and dabbing at a smear on Elara's cheek. "But you're a tireless worker, Elara. I've witnessed you polishing those boarding house floors to a mirror sheen. You'll breathe life into this place." She squeezed Elara's hand, her eyes radiating warmth that always belied her gruff exterior. "Besides," she added with a playful wink, "Ben needs a good woman and a decent slice of pie in his life. A bakery might just be the catalyst." The smile wavered, replaced by a subtle tension. Ben Holt. His very name triggered a complex reaction, a nervous flutter mixed with something best left unexamined. Their union was a calculated arrangement, a duty performed with the enthusiasm of balancing ledger books. His courteous detachment was more wounding than outright animosity. "Don't fret about Ben," Martha declared, seemingly attuned to her inner thoughts. "He's mule-headed, but there's a good heart lurking beneath that sheriff star and brooding demeanor. Someone just needs to melt the frost." She nudged Elara's arm, and a generous wedge of apple pie never hurt anyone. The ensuing days became a blur of activity. With Martha's assistance, Elara secured a reasonable lease from the surprisingly agreeable old man Hemmings. She cleaned, painted, and repaired, transforming the neglected space into a cheerful haven. Walls bloomed in a sunny yellow, and gingham curtains adorned the windows. A time-worn table became the centerpiece, destined to showcase her confectionery creations. Soon. The scent of baking permeated the boarding house, an alluring blend of cinnamon, vanilla, and sweet butter. Elara toiled relentlessly, her hands moving with instinctive grace, kneading, rolling, and frosting. Baking was her refuge, her solace, a way to conjure beauty and comfort in a world often characterized by hardship and indifference. Her inaugural batch of cookies, simple stars and horseshoes, rested on cooling racks. Elara gazed upon them, a tremor of anticipation fluttering in her stomach. This was it. This was her chance to prove herself, to carve out a niche in this remote, unforgiving landscape. The bell above the door announced her first patron. It was Sarah Jenkins, who worked at the saloon. Sarah's face reflected a premature world weariness, yet her eyes held a spark of intelligence and unexpected vulnerability. "Smells divine in here," Sarah commented, her voice a low murmur. "Thought I'd investigate the commotion." She leaned against the counter, her gaze sweeping over the cookies, pies, and muffins. Rather elegant for redemption. Elara offered a genuine smile, one that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "I hope they taste as enticing as they smell. Would you care to sample a cookie?" She presented Sarah with a star dusted with powdered sugar. Sarah hesitated, then accepted the offering. She nibbled cautiously, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly. "Not bad," she stated, her tone carefully controlled. "Actually, they're remarkably good." She devoured the remainder in 2 bites. "What's the name of this establishment?" "Rosewood Bakery," Elara replied, a surge of pride swelling within her. "Unpretentious, but it reflects me." "Rosewood Bakery," Sarah repeated, savoring the sound. "It suits you." She produced a coin from her pocket. "I'll take a dozen of those cookies. And a slice of that apple pie." Word spread swiftly. By noon, a constant stream of patrons flowed through the bakery, lured by the captivating aromas and the promise of sugary delights. Children with sticky fingers, cowboys bearing the dust of the trail, and weary housewives all queued to partake in Elara's treats. The town, it seemed, possessed an insatiable craving for sweets. Even Ben Holt appeared, though not until the late hour, after the busiest period. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his features obscured by the shadow of his hat. He seemed an anomaly, a lawman amidst a symphony of sugar and spice. Elara's heart did a little dance. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached him, her voice barely audible. "Ben, I didn't expect to see you here." He removed his hat, revealing a glimpse of dark hair and weathered lines around his eyes. "Heard favorable reports," he said, his voice rough-edged. "Decided to investigate." His gaze drifted over the shelves, pausing on the pies. "What are your recommendations?" "The apple pie is a favorite," Elara suggested, her voice gaining confidence. "But the blueberry muffins are fresh from the oven." He gave a slow nod. "A muffin, then, and coffee." He moved to a table and sat down, his movements precise, almost rigid. Elara poured him a cup and delivered a muffin on a delicate plate. He tasted it, chewing deliberately, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. A thick, awkward silence descended. Elara pretended to tidy behind the counter, straining to catch any sound, any indication of his impression. Finally, he swallowed, his gaze rising to meet hers. "It's good," he conceded, his voice still gruff, yet tinged with an elusive quality she couldn't quite decipher. "Very good." He finished the muffin and drank his coffee in silence. He rose, placed a coin on the table, and replaced his hat. "Thank you," he offered, his gaze briefly locking with hers. Then he turned and left, leaving Elara breathless and confused. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the town in long shadows, Elara leaned against the counter, spent yet invigorated. Rosewood Bakery was a success. The townspeople had embraced her, welcoming her into the fold. But Ben remained a puzzle, a locked door she lacked the key to open. She glanced at the table where he'd sat, the lingering scent of coffee and the ghost of his presence still lingering. Forging a new path was challenging, she knew. But perhaps, with persistence, kindness, and a well-placed slice of pie, she might even forge a new beginning with the taciturn sheriff who was her husband. Quiet admiration, Ben Holt sought refuge against the general store's wall, the rough planks pressing into his back. The sun, a white-hot forge in the sky, hammered redemption, stirring up miniature cyclones of dust, but the shadowed alcove offered a welcome reprieve. He wasn't on alert for trouble that day, his focus was riveted on Elara. Rosewood Bakery was bustling. The fragrance of baking apples and spice drifted out, a rich, almost overwhelming sweetness that usually irritated him. Yet, today, something felt different. Through the threshold he watched her move, a flurry of activity leaving a faint dusting of flour in her wake. He saw her share a laugh with Mrs. Peterson over a deformed loaf of bread, her smile unguarded, emanating a warmth that transcended the heat of the ovens. He noted how easily she connected with people. It wasn't a practiced charm, but an authentic connection, quite unlike the careful, almost apprehensive smiles he typically received. They saw the badge, the sidearm, the embodied law. Elara, it appeared, perceived something more. Or perhaps they discerned something new within her. A glimmer of hope in a town slowly suffocating under layers of grit and disappointment. A dull ache resonated in his chest. He hadn't requested her presence here, hadn't wanted this entire arrangement that felt like another shackle upon his weary soul. And yet, observing her, he couldn't ignore the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of redemption, a buoyancy he hadn't sensed in ages. He levered himself from the wall, the timber emitting a protesting creak. He craved coffee. Dark, potent, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of that ubiquitous apple pie. He crossed the thoroughfare, momentarily blinded by the glare. The chime of the bell over the bakery door echoed as he entered, announcing his arrival to the lively interior. The collective clamor dipped momentarily. Heads swiveled. Conversations stuttered. His effect on people was a constant, unwelcome reminder of his position. Ignoring it, he fixed his gaze on Elara, who was now drying her hands on her apron, her brow furrowed in concentration, as young Timmy Jenkins breathlessly recounted the escapades of a wandering calf. She tousled his hair in a light maternal gesture. Timmy's face lit up, pride blooming across his features. Then felt an unfamiliar twinge in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite place. It wasn't outright jealousy, precisely, but more like a keen yearning for something either long lost or never truly possessed. Finally, Elara's gaze met his, a flicker of surprise giving way to a cautious smile. "Sheriff?" she greeted, her voice clear and surprisingly self-assured. "What can I get for you?" He approached the counter, the combined sense of baked temptations intensifying. "Coffee, black, and a piece of apple pie." She nodded, her movements brisk as she poured him a steaming mug and cut a generous wedge of pie. The crust gleamed a deep golden brown, the filling practically overflowing with apples steeped in warm spices. It looked enticing. He slid a coin across the wood. "On the house," she countered, gently pushing the coin back. He frowned, his brow furrowing. "I pay my way, Elara." "Consider it a truce offering," she responded, her gaze steady. "We haven't exactly gotten off to the best start." He scrutinized her face, searching for even a trace of animosity, of the resentment he anticipated. He detected nothing but an unwavering resolve, the desire to bridge the chasm between them. Grudgingly, he pocketed the coin. He took a bite of the pie. It was remarkably delicious. The apples possessed a pleasant tartness, the crust a delicate flakiness, the sweetness in perfect harmony. He hadn't tasted anything this satisfying in years. He took a swig of the coffee, its bitterness a welcome counterpoint to the pie's sweetness. He ate in silence, observing the bakery's controlled pandemonium. Martha Abernathy flitted about, clearing tables and refilling mugs, her face a mask of brisk efficiency. She caught his eye and offered him a knowing smile, and he glanced away quickly. He finished the pie, the last morsel leaving a pleasant sweetness lingering on his palate. He placed the empty plate on the counter. "That was a good," he conceded, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. Elara's smile broadened, a genuine expression of pleasure. "Thank you, Sheriff." He nodded, unsure how to respond. He turned to depart, then paused. "Elara," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Be careful." She tilted her head, her brow furrowed with concern. "Careful of what?" "This towner." He trailed off, struggling to articulate the darkness that simmered beneath redemption's placid surface. "It can be brutal." She met his gaze without flinching. "I can handle myself, Sheriff." He wanted to believe her. He yearned to believe that her optimism, her inherent goodness, could somehow pierce the town's calloused exterior. But he knew better. He knew the malevolence lurking in the hearts of some, the secrets that festered in the hidden recesses. He simply nodded once and left, the bell above the door tinkling softly behind him. He registered Martha watching him from across the room, her expression pensive. He disregarded her and turned toward the sheriff's office, the weight of his obligations settling heavily upon him once more. Later that evening, after a meager supper of beans and die-old bread, Ben found himself drawn back to the bakery. The lights were still burning, painting a warm rectangle onto the otherwise deserted street. He noticed Martha sweeping, her movements unhurried and methodical. He hesitated, then crossed the expanse. He leaned against the doorframe, observing her. She glanced up, startled, then broke into a smile. "Sheriff, is there something I can help you with?" He shook his head slowly. "Just watching." Martha chuckled softly. "Watching Elara, you mean?" He offered no denial. "She's a good woman, Ben," Martha said, leaning on the handle of her broom. "A strong one. She deserves a shot at happiness." He remained mute, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "You know," Martha pressed, her tone gentling, "she talks about you, wonders what's behind those eyes of yours." He finally lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. "What does she say?" Martha hesitated for a moment, then sighed softly. "She says you're a good man, Sheriff. A deeply wounded one, but good nonetheless. She believes there's kindness buried beneath all that." She gestured vaguely in the vicinity of his face. "Well, you get the idea." He averted his gaze, his jaw clenched tightly. He didn't want her sympathy. He didn't want her insight. He certainly didn't want her hope. He was a broken man, and she was foolish to think otherwise. "She's wrong," he stated, his voice low and rasping. "Tell her she's wrong." Martha simply smiled, a knowing, almost commiserating smile. "I think she'll figure that out for herself, Sheriff." He wheeled around and walked away, leaving Martha standing in the doorway, the bakery's inviting light casting long, distorted shadows behind him. He walked until he reached the outskirts of town, the enveloping darkness seeming to swallow him whole. He remained there for an eternity, gazing out at the boundless, unforgiving terrain, the profound silence broken only by the desolate cry of a distant coyote. He was alone. He always had been, and he always would be. It was his curse, his burden. And Elara Rosewood, with her bakery and her innate compassion, wouldn't alter a single thing. Or so he desperately clung to believing. Shadows of suspicion. The iron bell, once a cheerful greeter, was now a memory, its absence a stark testament to the violence that had occurred. Dawn bled across the horizon, in somber shades of lavender and slate, as Ben arrived, the biting air, a tangible presence, despite his heavy coat. The store's entrance, a gaping maw, invited him into the gloom. Within, dust motes pirouetted in the meager light that squeezed through the dingy panes, illuminating chaos, toppled shelves, scattered goods. A fine layer of flour powdered the floor, mimicking a recent snowfall, marred by the sticky pools of spilled molasses and a scattering of beans. "Damn," Ben rasped, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. He knelt, tracing the splintered edge of a display case with calloused fingers. The broken glass offered a treacherous resistance. The lock, twisted and useless, spoke of raw power. Subtlety had been abandoned at the threshold. He straightened, his gaze encompassing the wreckage. Martha, her complexion ashen and her face a roadmap of worry, huddled near the back, wrapped tight in a threadbare shawl. "Sheriff," she breathed, her voice fragile as spun glass. They took everything they could carry off." Ben moved towards her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Everything, Martha?" She nodded, her eyes shimmering with suppressed tears. The cash box, most of the supplies, even the bolts of fabric I'd set aside for winter stitching. Barely left a thing. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, the gesture surprisingly tender. Did you see or hear anything unusual? Martha shook her head, her gaze skittish, darting towards the violated doorway. I live upstairs. I didn't stir until I came down to open. Found it just like this. Ben surveyed the scene once more, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The disarray hinted at desperation, yes, but also a wild abandon. Not the work of seasoned criminals, but desperate souls driven by necessity or some darker urge. Moving towards the back, his boots crunched on the detritus underfoot. He caught a faint, unfamiliar tang in the air, sharp and unsettling. Do you smell something odd, Martha? He inquired, his voice hushed. Martha cautiously sniffed the air. Now that you mention it, there was a sort of scorched smell. I thought it was just the lamp, but... Ben tracked the odor to a small, blackened patch on the floorboards near the rear exit. Kneeling, he examined it closely. A clumsy attempt to obscure their trail, perhaps? Or a signal left for Confederates? He stood, his expression hardening. This was more than simple theft. Something else was simmering beneath the surface. A chill snaked its way down his spine. By mid-morning, word of the robbery had ripped through Redemption like a prairie fire. A cluster of townsfolk had coalesced outside Abernathy's, their faces canvases of unease and fear. Murmurs snaked through the group, escalating with each tick of the clock. Outlaws, someone muttered, their voice heavy with apprehension. They'll be back. Too quiet for too long. Another voice chimed in, laced with fatalism. Knew it couldn't last. Ben stood on the porch of the store, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the anxious assembly. He understood that dread he shedded. Redemption bore the scars of past transgressions, and the specter of those dark times lingered like a persistent shadow. "Sheriff, what will you do?" A woman called from the crowd, her voice edged with worry. "Are you going to let them just waltz away with this?" Ben met her gaze, his expression firm. "I'm going to find them," he stated, his voice a declaration of intent. "And I'm bringing them to justice." His words offered a meager solace, but the fear remained, a palpable presence in the air, heavy as a thunderhead. As the crowd thinned, dissolving into hushed conversations, Ben felt a touch on his arm. It was Elara, her brow furrowed with concern. "Ben, are you all right?" she inquired, her voice gentle. "You seem troubled." He looked at her, at the genuine worry etched on her face, and a faint flicker of warmth sparked within him. But he ruthlessly extinguished it, shoving it back into the recesses where it belonged. "I'm fine," he answered, his tone clipped. "Just doing my job." Elara remained steadfast. "It's more than that, isn't it? This isn't just about stolen merchandise." He hesitated, his gaze becoming guarded. He didn't want to drag her into this, didn't want her exposed to the darkness that festered beneath Redemption's veneer. "Stay out of it, Elara," he warned, his voice low. "This is my burden." Her expression sharpened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "It's everyone's burden, Ben. This is our town, too." He sighed, running a weary hand through his hair. He knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the conviction that this was a battle he had to wage alone. He looked into her eyes and saw something he'd never seen before, and then he looked away. "Justy, be careful," he relented, his voice softer now. "And keep the bakery bolted up tight." He turned and walked away, leaving Elara standing on the porch, her gaze following his retreating form. He knew he was pushing her away, but he couldn't stop himself. He was a walking danger to her, a shadow that threatened to consume everything she touched. He was a stranger to himself, and he didn't want to drag her into the abyss. He mounted his horse, the saddle leather groaning in protest. He spurred the animal forward, leaving the town shrinking behind, heading towards the sprawling, unforgiving wilderness that lay ahead. He had a duty to fulfill, a debt to settle, and he would, even if it meant confronting the demons that haunted him, even if it meant losing himself in the bargain. He'd deliver these outlaws to the law, but he questioned whether he could tolerate himself afterwards. He was beginning to care, but wasn't sure he could permit the warmth. He had to safeguard Elara and redemption, even if that meant causing them pain. A glimmer of honor, the air around Elara swirled with the comforting perfume of yeast and cinnamon, a fragile barrier against the persistent unease gripping redemption since the robbery. The bakery, once a vibrant hub, now felt muted and still. Even Mrs. Abernathy, back at her post for the daily gossip, lowered her voice, glances skittering towards the window as if expecting trouble. Elara attacked the dough, meeting with a ferocity that belied its soft texture, a physical outlet for her building anxiety. Ben remained absent since his clipped dismissal that night. His command reverberated in her thoughts. Stay out of it, Elara. Not as a partner, but treated like a fragile thing, unworthy of explanation. A disturbance outside snagged her attention. A small cluster of townsfolk had formed near the sheriff's station. Wiping floury hands on her apron, Elara peered through the window. She spotted Ben, his imposing frame a familiar landmark against the backdrop of the parched street. But her attention wasn't on his stature. It was the sight of him kneeling, head inclined toward a figure huddled on the hard bench. It was Martha Abernathy, her face a mask of tear-streaked despair. The words were lost to her, but she noted the gentle reassurance in Ben's touch, his large, weathered hand patting her arm with unexpected tenderness. His voice, a low, soothing rumble, appeared to calm the distraught woman. Elara observed, surprised. This wasn't the unyielding lawman she'd come to expect, but a man offering solace, exhibiting a surprising vein of compassion. The scene unfolded for a few moments before Martha straightened, her posture subtly improved, her steps a shade less faltering. Ben watched her departure, his gaze lingering before he straightened and vanished into the station. Returning to her dough, Elara felt a subtle lightening of her spirit. It was a small act, ostensibly insignificant, yet it revealed a glimpse into the man concealed beneath the steely badge, a man she suspected was buried deep. The subsequent hours dissolved in a flurry of baking and serving customers, but the picture of Ben comforting Martha lingered. As twilight painted redemption in hues of umber and shadow, the lamp in the sheriff's office still burned bright. She knew he was relentless, wholly dedicated to restoring order, to shielding the town that both respected and resented him. An idea bloomed in her thoughts. With quick, practiced movements, she crafted a pair of her finest apple turnovers, their crusts burnished gold and glistening under a sugary sheen. Then, she brewed a pot of dark, fragrant coffee, its aroma permeating the bakery. She arranged the pastries in a small wicker basket, filled a thermos with the steaming brew, and ventured into the cool night air. The street lay deserted, save for the occasional stray dog sniffing amongst the wooden planks. The faint sounds of revelry drifted from the saloon. Elara approached the sheriff's office, her steps measured and uncertain. She couldn't anticipate Ben's reaction, but she felt compelled to offer something, a modest offering of gratitude, a wordless acknowledgement of his burden. Reaching the door, she hesitated, hand hovering before pushing it open and stepping inside. Ben was bent over a morass of paperwork, the dim light casting stark angles on his face. He looked up, his gaze sharpening as he recognized Elara. "What do you want?" he queried, his tone rough-edged. Elara raised the basket slightly. "I brought coffee and turnovers. You've been working since dawn." He regarded the basket, his expression inscrutable. "I don't need handouts, Elara." "It isn't a handout," she countered softly. "It's just a thank you." Silence stretched between them, his gaze fixed on her face. She braced herself for rejection, for another brusque dismissal. Then he sighed, a heavy sound laden with weariness. "Just put it on the desk," he conceded, his voice softening slightly. Elara smiled and placed the basket and thermos on the nearest clear surface. "I should get back," he began, his voice halting her retreat. Turning back, her pulse quickened. "Thank you," he offered, his gaze briefly meeting hers. "I appreciate it." It was a small, simple gesture, but it resonated. A chink in the armor he wore, a glimpse of the man veiled by that stoic facade. Elara nodded. "Good night, then." Leaving the office, a warmth kindled in her chest. The night air felt cleaner. The stars shone more brilliantly. Building a life with Ben Holt would be a challenge. He was a complex man, haunted by shadows, burdened by duty. But tonight, she witnessed a spark of integrity, a flicker of humanity, and it fueled her hope. Later, Ben remained at his desk, the paperwork ignored. His eyes were drawn to the apple turnover, its sugary glaze gleaming in the lamplight. He hadn't touched it, hadn't eaten since the morning. Lifting the pastry, its warmth surprised him. He took a bite. The explosion of sweet, tangy filling was an unexpected pleasure, a contrast to the acrid taste that usually lingered. He closed his eyes, savoring the flavor. He hadn't realized the extent of his hunger, not just for sustenance, but for something undefined, something deeper. He finished the pastry, slowly, deliberately. Then he poured a cup of coffee, its rich scent filling the cramped room. He took a sip, the warmth seeping through him. His gaze fixed on the empty basket, a silent testament to Elara's gesture. He didn't merit such kindness. He knew it. He'd been pushing her away, attempting to shield her from the darkness that clung to him. Yet she persisted, offering flashes of light, of possibility. He knew he couldn't maintain that distance forever. Eventually, he'd have to confront his past, to grapple with the demons that pursued him. And perhaps, just perhaps, with Elara at his side, he could finally discover peace. An outsider's insight, a heavy shroud of foreboding hung in Redemption's town hall. Lanterns cast elongated, wavering figures across anxious faces. The Abernathy's general store theft had shattered the inhabitants' already precarious tranquility. Elara sat next to Ben, his jaw's rigid line a familiar sight. Across the way, Martha Abernathy, ashen-faced but resolute, gripped a handkerchief in trembling hands. Sarah Jenkins, her saloon attire a flamboyant contrast to the somber garb around her, offered Elara a fleeting, sympathetic smile. Ben's rising figure instantly commanded attention. The room fell silent, every gaze latching onto the sheriff. "As you all know," he began, his voice a low rasp, "Abernathy's was violated last night. An inquiry is underway." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I need any details, no matter how slight they may appear." A low rumble of voices stirred through the room. Jedediah Smith, the blacksmith, his voice laced with indignation, spoke first. "Sheriff, we know you're doing what you can, but this is escalating. First cattle vanish, now this. We need answers, Sheriff." Ben's expression remained unchanged. "We'll find them, Jedediah. Your help is vital." The meeting dragged on, an endless stream of grievances punctuated by Ben's clipped replies. Elara absorbed the atmosphere, thick with dread and mistrust. She registered subtle cues, nuanced shifts in posture, averted gazes. Hers was a perspective uncolored by years of local history and prejudice. Finally, as the gathering threatened to devolve into fruitless squabbling, Elara interjected, her voice soft yet resonant in the sudden hush. "Sheriff, might I add something?" Ben turned, a hint of surprise flicking across his features. He hadn't anticipated her speaking, certainly not publicly. "Go ahead, Elara." She inhaled deeply, bracing herself against the weight of scrutiny. "I'm a newcomer, but I've observed a few things. The theft. It reeked of insider knowledge. Whoever was behind it knew the store's nuances, Martha's habits. This wasn't random desperation." A murmur of dissent rippled through the room. "Are you implying it was someone local, Mrs. Holt?" Jedediah demanded, his tone sharp. "I'm merely pointing out a possibility," Elara countered evenly. "A stranger wouldn't know the back gate was vulnerable or that Martha stored receipts in the same place." Ben's gaze sharpened. "That's a serious suggestion, Elara." "It's not an accusation, Ben," she stated, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "It's a credible theory and shouldn't be dismissed." Martha Abernathy, silent until now, spoke, her voice barely audible. "She has a point, Sheriff. It must have been someone familiar with my routine. They knew I often left the back unlocked until late." Silence descended once more, laden with the weight of Elara's words. Ben studied her, his expression inscrutable. He disliked the inference of betrayal within his jurisdiction by someone he knew. "Thank you, Elara," he said finally, his tone measured. "I'll consider your input." He addressed the crowd. "This meeting is adjourned." The townsfolk slowly dispersed, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and suspicion. Martha Abernathy approached Elara, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you for speaking up, Elara. It took courage." "Of course, Martha," Elara replied, squeezing her hand. "I wanted to help." Sarah Jenkins also lingered, a knowing glint in her eyes. "You stirred the pot tonight, Elara." This town needed a jolt. As the hall emptied, Elara turned to Ben, who was gathering his belongings. "Did I overstep?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He regarded her, his face still masked by that familiar stoicism. "It's my duty to class." "Investigate, Elara." "Not yours." "I understand that," she said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "But I saw things you couldn't. A fresh viewpoint can be valuable." He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "I have to examine all angles, Elara, even the ones I resist." They walked to the bakery in silence, tension hanging thick between them. Elara knew she had challenged him, questioned his authority, and she sensed his resentment. But she couldn't remain silent while he chased shadows, as the answer might be within reach. Back at the bakery, the warm fragrance of fresh bread filled the air, a welcome contrast to the town hall's oppressive atmosphere. Elara began tidying, her movements quick and precise. Ben stood by the counter, watching her. "Elara," he said at last, his voice softer now, "I appreciate your intent to assist, but this is treacherous. You don't know these people as intimately as I do." "Perhaps not," she said, turning to face him, "but I'm learning, and I'm not easily intimidated." He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "You should be." Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the hearth's gentle crackle. Elara held his stare, refusing to yield. She knew he was trying to protect her, but she refused to be silenced. She had a voice, and she intended to employ it. Later that night, lying in bed, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that she had breached a boundary with Ben. She had questioned his judgment, challenged his command, and she wondered if he would forgive her. Yet, she had spoken her truth, and she couldn't apologize for that. She heard Ben moving in the next room, his footsteps heavy and measured. She wondered about his thoughts, his strategies. She knew he wouldn't rest until he had unraveled the mystery, and she hoped, despite their differences, she could aid him in his search. The next morning, Elara arose early and headed to the bakery. She hoped for a head start on the day, a distraction from the tension between her and Ben. Kneading dough, she heard the door chime. Ben entered. He walked to the counter and sat, his expression unreadable. "I've been pondering what you suggested last night," he began, his voice subdued. "About the break-in being orchestrated from within." Elara ceased kneading, her heart pounding. "And? I'm not conceding you're correct," he continued. "However, I can't ignore the chance. I'll re-interview everyone, especially those familiar with Martha's habits." A spark of hope ignited within Elara. He was listening. He was open to her perspective, even if it clashed with his own. "I ask nothing more, Ben," she said softly. "Simply maintain a balanced view." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "There's more," he said, hesitating. "I reviewed the records. Abernathy's was in financial straits recently. Martha took loans from unsavory characters." Elara's brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting she orchestrated the robbery herself?" Ben shrugged. "It's possible. I need to investigate." The weight of the town's secrets seemed to press down, the darkness lurking beneath threatening to consume them. Solving the robbery was only a start. Deeper, more sinister forces were at play in redemption, and she and Ben were caught in their tide. As Ben turned to leave, Elara stopped him. "Be cautious, Ben," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Whoever's behind this is dangerous." He regarded her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I always am, Elara." He touched his hat's brim and walked into the morning light, leaving Elara alone with her thoughts, the pervasive aroma of fresh bread filling the air. Building trust, the scent of warm dough and spiced apples still clung to Elara, a comforting perfume against the weariness that tugged at her limbs as she swabbed the bakery counter. The morning's chaos had given way to a tranquil stillness, broken only by the oven's gentle clicks as it cooled. At a nearby table, Ben sat, the old chair groaning softly beneath him. He nursed his coffee, eyes lost in the outside world, the shadow of his hat obscuring his features. Still wrestling with Abernathy's disappearance, Elara murmured, more a statement of fact than inquiry. She leaned against the counter, arms folded. Ben pivoted, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "It's my duty, Elara." "Vanished things don't simply return themselves." "Unless someone wants them buried," she retorted, pushing off the counter to approach his table. "What about Silas Blackwood? He's got a known appetite for gambling. Spotted him at the saloon last night." Ben savored a sip of his brew. "Blackwood? He runs a solid business, Elara. The lumber mill. Doubt he'd jeopardize everything over some pocket change from Abernathy." "Perhaps it was more than pocket change," Elara proposed, sliding into the seat opposite him. "You mentioned Martha's financial straits. Maybe someone saw a chance for easy debt collection." He sighed, rubbing his hand across his stubbled chin. "I'll look into Blackwood's movements, but don't hold your breath." A hint of a smile graced Elara's lips. "That's all I ask." A beat of silence, then, with slight hesitation, "Ben, about yesterday I didn't intend to pry so deep." He met her gaze, his expression an opaque mask. "You spoke your mind. It's in your nature." He offered nothing more, leaving her to decipher his meaning. The quiet that followed hung heavy with unsaid thoughts. Elara shattered it. "So, aside from thief-catching and coffee-drinking, what does a sheriff do around here?" A spark amusement perhaps flickered in his eyes. "Keeps the peace. Mediates disputes. Prevents folks from ventilating each other over a bad poker hand." "Sounds thrilling," she quipped. He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that caught her off guard. "It has its moments." "What did you do before redemption?" she ventured, emboldened by his fleeting good humor. "Before the badge?" His face shuddered, the brief amusement vanishing like smoke. "That's in the past, Elara." Undeterred, she pressed gently. "Everyone has one, Ben. It shapes us." He was silent, lost in the swirling depths of his coffee. At last he spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I was a soldier, during the war." The stark simplicity of his statement spoke volumes. Elara knew better than to poke at the scars he carried. "Thank you for sharing that," she replied softly. He nodded curtly, then swiftly changed tack. "What about you? Why redemption? Why bind yourself to a man you barely knew?" Elara hesitated. Now it was her turn to guard the gate. "I wanted a clean slate," she said, carefully selecting her words. "A place where I could simply be. And am I aiding that endeavor?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She met his scrutiny, honestly. "You're complicated, Ben. But I think you're trying." He glanced away, towards the window, and a lengthy silence descended once more. Sensing his boundaries, Elara let it rest. That afternoon, as Elara kneaded the dough for tomorrow's loaves, Ben reappeared. He loomed in the doorway, hat twisting in his hands, looking strangely uncertain. "I spoke with Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice subdued. "He has an alibi for the night Abernathy vanished. Claims he was at a poker game in Silver Creek." "And you believe him?" Elara questioned, wiping flour from her palms. "I checked it out. A few patrons confirmed his presence." He paused, then continued. "There's something else. I dug into those loans Martha Abernathy secured." Elara waited, her pulse quickening. "They weren't bank loans," Ben revealed, his tone grim. "They came from a man named Jedediah Stone. He's a loan shark, preying on the desperate with crippling interest rates." "Stone," Elara echoed, a shiver tracing her spine. "I've heard the name whispered. They say he has a stranglehold on half this town." Ben confirmed. "He's a dangerous man, Elara. Steer clear of him." "What do you plan to do?" she asked, anxiety lacing her voice. "I'm going to find out what he's meddling in," Ben vowed, his jaw set. "And I'm going to put a stop to it." He pivoted to leave, but Elara halted him. "Ben, wait." She hesitated, Ben blurted out, "You don't have to shoulder this alone." He turned back, his eyes betraying a tangle of appreciation and trepidation. "I work solo, Elara. Always have." "Maybe that's why you're always fighting an uphill battle," she pointed out gently. He regarded her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Just be careful, Elara. Stone doesn't abide by any rules." He turned and vanished, leaving Elara alone in the bakery, her mind swirling. Jedediah Stone. The name resonated with a menacing weight. She knew with chilling certainty that this was only the prologue. Later that evening, after the bakery was shuttered and the town had succumbed to slumber, Elara discovered Ben on the porch, his gaze fixed on the inky blackness. She settled beside him, the aged wood creaking softly. "It's a beautiful night," she offered, breaking the stillness. Ben grunted in acknowledgement. "Ben," Elara began, choosing her words with care, "I know you're not fond of discussing your history, but perhaps it would help me to understand you better." He remained silent, lost in thought, then spoke, his voice a near whisper. "There was a woman," he said. "Before you. Her name was Sarah." Elara held her breath, waiting for him to continue. She died," he rasped, his voice cracking. "A fever took her swiftly." Elara reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was rough and weathered, yet his grip was remarkably gentle. "I'm so sorry, Ben," she whispered. He made no reply, but she felt his hand clench around hers. In that shared quiet, beneath the endless expanse of stars, a tender trust began to blossom. It was a fragile thing, a spark of hope flickering in the darkness, but it was enough to sustain them, enough to confront whatever ordeals lay ahead. Stolen kissed the desert air, a surprising counterpoint to the day's scorching memory, nipped at exposed skin beneath the high-riding moon, turning the world below into a study of silver and obsidian. Elara huddled deeper into her shawl, fighting the shivers. Beside her, Ben stood as unyielding as a weathered butt, his focus riveted on the shadowy mouth of the saloon across the dusty expanse. Hours had bled into the night, their so-called stakeout a vigil for Jedediah Stone's inevitable move. The Rosewood Bakery, usually redolent with warm spices, now surrendered to the arid wind and a shared sense of foreboding. "They coming, you think?" Elara murmured, her voice barely audible above the crickets' chirping song. A grunt rumbled from Ben, a response as ambiguous as the shifting sands. Tonight, however, she wouldn't be deterred. She was learning his language of silences, spotting the submerged currents of emotion beneath his hardened exterior. He was a fortress she was determined to explore, a riddle she yearned to unravel. "You've been quieter than a tomb since we arrived," she pressed, adjusting her position on the unforgiving bench. "Is this standard procedure for all your dates, Sheriff?" A tick pulsed in his jaw. "This isn't a date, Elara." Perhaps not," she conceded. "But it possesses the potential, doesn't it? Should we choose to see it that way?" He finally shifted his gaze, the intensity of his shadowed eyes locking with hers. "Don't push your luck, Elara." "What's the harm in trying?" she challenged, her voice hushed. "What exactly are you so afraid of?" He looked away, back to the saloon, his face a canvas of deeply etched weariness. "Things that would curdle your blood." "I'm not breakable china, Ben," she countered, a spark of defiance flickering in her gaze. "I'm tougher than you think. Are you?" "Now?" he asked, his tone laced with a dangerous undertow. "Are you ready to witness the depths men can sink to? Are you prepared to confront what I've done?" The naked vulnerability in his voice checked her. She understood, in theory, that he was a veteran, that he carried burdens that would crush a lesser soul. But hearing him acknowledge it, seeing the raw agony in his gaze, was different. It stripped away the facade, revealing the man beneath. "I don't know," she admitted, her own voice gentler. "But I want to try." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unuttered confessions. Above, The cosmos blazed with an indifferent splendor, casting elongated, grotesque shapes across the street. The encroaching cold seeped into their bones. Elara rubbed her arms against the chill, then noticed the gesture. Wordlessly, he shrugged off his worn coat and placed it around her shoulders. The garment was weighty, imbued with the scent of leather and gun oil, an aroma intrinsically his. She burrowed into it, a peculiar solace blooming in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He offered no verbal reply, but she glimpsed a flicker of humanity in his gaze, a softening of the harsh lines framing his mouth. It was enough for now. They remained in companionable silence, their vigil punctuated by the saloon's unblinking windows and the distant lament of a coyote. The taut tension slowly unwound, replaced by a tentative sense of tranquility. Elara eased back against the bench, her gaze drawn to the celestial tapestry overhead. "Spectacular, aren't they?" she murmured. "Infinite, it seems." "Remind you of anything?" Ben offered. "Hope," she replied. "Endless possibilities." He offered a brief, mirthless chuckle. "You're an unrepentant optimist, Elara Rosewood. I'll grant you that." "Someone has to be," she retorted, turning to face him squarely. "Especially in redemption." He looked at her then, a deep, probing appraisal. She met his gaze without flinching, unafraid. She saw not only the pain, the desolation, the weight he carried, but also something hidden beneath Ka. The layers of scar tissue, a fragile ember of hope. He reached out, his hand hesitating before gently cradling her cheek. His touch was rough, calloused, yet surprisingly tender. Her breath caught in her throat. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You deserve safety, far from this mess." "But I am," she countered, barely audible. "I'm here, with you." He searched her eyes, seeking confirmation, truth. Then, with a low groan, he bridged the remaining space. His lips found hers in a kiss that was both hesitant and fervent, a silent supplication, a desperate act of faith, a stolen moment, a forbidden pleasure, a taste of dust and regret Ka, intertwined with something sweeter, something akin to absolution. Elara responded instinctively, her arms rising to encircle his neck, drawing him near. She channeled all her longing, all her faith, all her conviction into the kiss. She wanted to convey that he wasn't alone, that he was worthy of affection, that joy wasn't beyond his reach. The kiss deepened, growing increasingly intense, passionate. He tasted of whiskey, smoke, and a raw, untamed spirit that resonated within her very core. A wave of heat surged through her, a conflagration melting the icy barriers around her heart. He broke away abruptly, his breathing ragged, his eyes a turbulent mix of desire and apprehension. "I never should have done that," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Why not?" she asked, her own voice barely a whisper. "Because it's not fair to you," he replied, turning away, his gaze directed toward the horizon. "I have nothing to offer. No promises, no future, not even security. I don't need promises, Ben," she insisted, reaching out to touch his arm. "I only need you." He recoiled from her touch, as if burned. "Don't say that, Elara. Don't make this any harder." "I'm not trying to make it harder," she said softly. "I'm trying to lighten the load, to show you don't have to bear it by yourself." He remained motionless, his back rigid, his shoulders slumped with the burden of his past. Elara realized she couldn't force him to unveil himself, couldn't eradicate his suffering with a mere kiss. However, she could demonstrate her unwavering support, her steadfast belief in him. She moved closer, encircling him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "We'll find a way," she whispered. "Together." He offered no response, but she detected a subtle tremor coursing through his frame. She embraced him tighter, offering what solace she could. For a sustained moment, they stood united beneath the silent vigilance of the Cree. Stars. Two adrift souls clinging to each other in the vast emptiness of the desert landscape. The world remained perilous, the future uncertain, but for that fleeting instant, they were no longer isolated. They had found each other. Echoes of yesterday, the midday sun hammered redemption, distorting the dusty street into a shimmering illusion. A drone of flies circled the overflowing trough by the Grad. Saloon. The only sound puncturing the strained stillness that had gripped the town after the near-kiss of the previous night. Ben, jaw clenched tight, leaned against the sheriff's office porch, his gaze sweeping the horizon. A premonition chilled him as storm brewed, far worse than any weather front. A distant vibration stirred the air, escalating rapidly. Not thunder. Something heavier. Instinctively, Ben's hand drifted to the Colt peacemaker resting at his hip. A plume of dust billowed into sight, solidifying into a band of riders. 6 figures, weathered hard by the unforgiving land. Their mounts were slick with sweat, their expressions set like granite. They carried a purpose that felt like a physical weight. The lead rider, a man framed by a dense dark beard and eyes that glittered with Arctic fire, halted his horse squarely before the sheriff's office, his cohorts spread out, effectively barricading the thoroughfare. The townsfolk, sensing peril, vanished into their homes, faces flickering behind window panes. "Halt!" The man's voice, a gravelly rasp, cut through the sudden quiet. "Benjamin Holt." Then pushed away from the porch, his boots landing on the parched earth with a muffled sound. He advanced toward the man, his face an impassive mask. "I'm Holt. What brings you to redemption?" The man dismounted, his movements lithe and dangerous. Towering over Ben by a head, his shadow enveloped the sheriff. "Name's Cole Younger. I'm here to settle accounts." A knot tightened in Ben's stomach. Younger. The surname echoed from the murk of his past, a spectre risen. Keeping his voice calm, he responded, "Accounts for what, Younger?" "Redemption keeps the peace." Cole Younger's laugh cracked the air, a dry, mirthless sound. "Peaceful? You call this sun-baked purgatory peaceful? You're standing on hallowed ground, Holt, ground you desecrated." He spat, the globule landing scant inches from Ben's boots. "Spare me the pretense. You know damn well why I'm here." Ben's gaze sharpened. He knew, all right. He had simply refused to voice it, even to himself. He'd interred that chapter of his life, attempted to flee its grasp, yet some shadows refused to shorten. Whatever transpired, it's buried. This town bears no consequence. "The past has teeth, Sheriff." Cole's voice dripped with venom. He closed the gap between them, his stare drilling into Ben. "Particularly when it concerns a life you so carelessly extinguished." The atmosphere vibrated with tension, then felt the collective gaze of the town boring into him from darkened interiors. He had to de-escalate, safeguard redemption. "I'm at a loss as to what you're talking about." A lie, coating his tongue like bitter ash. Cole Younger's features hardened into a mask of scorn. "Don't insult me, Holt. You recall Sarah, don't you? Sarah, my sister." The name slammed into Ben like a physical blow. Sarah. The very sound conjured a surge of memories, of shared laughter and clandestine kisses beneath a canopy of stars. Memories he'd tried to entomb alongside the guilt that relentlessly gnawed at him. His face betrayed him. A fleeting tremor of anguish crossed his features. Cole saw it. Ah, recognition dawns. The woman you pledged to safeguard. The woman you condemned. Ben's fists clenched. That's not the way it played out, he managed, his voice strained. Wasn't it? You were meant to be her bulwark, her guardian. Instead, you led her directly into harm's way. Cole's voice gained volume, the simmering rage threatening to erupt. She loved you, Holt, placed her faith in you, and you repaid her with oblivion. A ripple of murmurs passed through the concealed onlookers. The name Sarah lingered in the air, laden with unspoken history. Ben's secrets were now a public spectacle, played out on redemption's dusty stage. I loved her too, Ben whispered, the admission a long unspoken burden. Cole scoffed, a dismissive snort. Love? Your brand of affection leaves corpses in its wake. Sarah died because of you. And now you will atone. He drew his pistol, the metallic snick shattering the silence. It all culminates here, Holt. Ben remained still, making no move toward his own weapon. His face wore a wariness that transcended his years. He understood he had earned this. He had been evading it for far too long. Perhaps this was his absolution, a chance to finally redress the sins of his former life. I'm ready, Ben stated, devoid of all expression. He lowered his eyelids, anticipating the inevitable. But the gunshot remained absent. A voice, ringing with clarity and resolve, sliced through the taut air. Cole Younger. Stand down! Elara emerged from the throng, her face pale yet unwavering. She positioned herself between Ben and Cole, her presence a bulwark against the approaching tempest. Cole Younger's gaze narrowed, locking on Elara. Remove cow. Yourself, woman. This is not your concern. It becomes my concern when you threaten the sheriff of this town, Elara declared, her voice firm. Whatever history binds you and Ben belongs to you both, but I won't allow you to convert redemption into a killing field. Ben's eyes snapped open. He stared at Elara, his heart hammering against his ribs. He longed to urge her to run, to escape the danger, but the words died in his throat. He stood transfixed, suspended between his past and his present, between the darkness that haunted him and the glimmer of light Elara offered. You are out of your depth, little lady. Cole's voice was deceptively gentle. This man is a slayer. He will bring you nothing but devastation. Elara stood firm. I know Ben Holt, and I know he is not a killer at heart. He's a decent man who has erred, just like all of us. Cole Younger's face contorted with fury. He lowered his gun slightly, his glare shifting back to Ben. This has not reached its conclusion, Holt. Not by a long stretch. I will be watching you. And when you least expect it, I shall return, and the next time, no one will impede my path. He returned his weapon to its holster and addressed his men. Let us depart. The gang swung their horses around and exited Redemption with matching haste, leaving a town reeling and a sheriff confronted by the demons of his past. Elara turned to Ben, her eyes mirroring her worry. He appeared to have aged 10 years in as many minutes. Ben, she said softly, reaching to touch his arm. He recoiled slightly, drawing back from her touch. I'm all right, he said roughly. Just add, go inside. Elara, this isn't your battle. It is my battle. Ben, she stated, determination lacing her tone. I'm staying put. His gaze met hers, pain and apprehension swirling within. He understood she would not relent, and that was the most terrifying truth of all. He could not shield her from this. This was his affliction, his burden to bear. And now she stood beside him, ready to share the weight. He knew he should repel her, for her own welfare. But he found that he couldn't. Not any longer. Secrets unearthed, the lingering scent of yeast and cinnamon, clung to Elara as she crossed the gritty street toward the sheriff's office. The bakery was finally acquiring the feel of home. Its aroma, a warm shield against redemption's ever-present tension. She'd insisted on straightening Ben's workspace. He'd resisted, naturally, but the glint of something like appreciation in his gaze had spurred her on. Office, as usual, epitomized bare-bones utility. A desk, marred by the ghosts of countless bureaucratic battles, sat beneath a window offering a bleak vista of the town's artery. The air tasted of stale tobacco and aged leather. Aroma Elara was slowly assimilating, a smell now inextricably linked to Ben. She began with the disarray, sifting through notices, delinquent invoices, and piles of time-worn ledgers. Ben was fastidious in his own gruff manner, but orderly was hardly a fitting descriptor for his methods. He embraced a more controlled kind of anarchy. While shifting a particularly hefty ledger, a corner of something hidden beneath snagged her attention. It was a folded piece of parchment, aged to a sepia tone, bound with a fragile string. Intrigued, Elara carefully loosened the knot. The paper crinkled as she unfurled it, revealing a meticulously rendered map and a series of names inscribed in a precise, almost calligraphic hand. The names stopped her breath. She recognized many. Notorious brigands. Men who had plagued the territories for years. Cutthroats, killers, and thieves. Then, at the list's bottom, scribbled in a discernibly different ink, was a name searingly familiar: Benjamin Holt. A wave of dizziness swept over her. She scanned the list again, her eyes flitting between the names and the map, struggling to decipher its meaning. The cartography depicted a network of layers and meeting points, all marked with unsettling accuracy. The air in the cramped office suddenly felt oppressive, almost unbreathable. She slumped into Ben's worn chair, the parchment trembling in her grasp. How could this be? Ben, the steadfast, principled sheriff, associated with these outlaws? Footsteps echoed closer, drawing near. Ben, returning. Panic seized her. She swiftly refolded the parchment, concealing it back under the ledger precisely as it had been. Her pulse hammered in her ears, a frantic rhythm against the room's quiet. Ben stepped inside. His face a landscape of weariness etched deep into his features. He paused just over the threshold, his gaze immediately finding hers. "What's wrong?" His voice was a low rumble that usually soothed her, but now sent icy prickles down her spine. Elara manufactured a smile, a feeble charade of composure. "Just dusty in here. More than I thought." He remained unconvinced. His eyes, those piercing blues she had come to trust implicitly, narrowed, scrutinizing. "You look like you've seen a specter." "Just tired," she insisted, perhaps too hastily. She stood, flicking imaginary dust motes from her skirt. "I should head back to the bakery. The bread demands my attention." She moved toward the exit, but Ben intervened, barring her way. "Elara." His hand extended, lightly touching her arm. His touch, usually a haven, now felt like a brand. She recoiled, almost imperceptibly, but enough to register with him. "What is it?" He pressed, his voice softening with awe. "Concern. You can confide in me." She couldn't. Not yet. Not until she'd had time to process her discovery, to reconcile the man she knew with the inscription on that damning list. "Nothing, Ben," she replied, her voice barely audible, "just too tired." She slid past him, into the waning sunlight. Redemption's familiar streets now seemed altered, tainted by her secret. Every shadow whispered accusations. Every face held a concealed judgment. Back at the bakery, the oven's heat did little to dispel the dread that had taken root. She went through the motions of preparing dough, her hands moving on autopilot while her thoughts raced. Later, once the final loaf had been sold and the shutters secured, Elara sat by the window, gazing at the shadowed street. The bakery's silence was profound, punctuated only by the old building's occasional groan. She couldn't dismiss the parchment's image, the inventory of names, Ben's among them. Was it a fabrication? A coincidence? Or something far more insidious? Sleep offered no sanctuary. She thrashed, tormented by fleeting visions of masked marauders, plundered riches, and Ben's countenance, his expression indecipherable. The following dawn, she awoke with a renewed resolve. She needed answers, and she wouldn't relent until she had them. She encountered Ben at the stables, preparing his mount. The morning's nascent light cast elongated shadows across his features, accentuating the lines of fatigue and the implacable set of his jaw. "Then," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He turned, his gaze locking with hers. He waited, wordless, allowing her to gather her composure. "I need to ask you something," she pressed, her voice finding strength. "Something crucial." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yesterday," she continued, "while I was tidying your office," she paused, inhaling deeply. "I came across something." A hint of darkness flashed across his expression. "A piece of parchment," she revealed, her voice steady now, "containing a roster of names." He remained mute, his gaze unwavering. "Your name was there, Ben," she uttered, the words suspended between them, "alongside some very perilous individuals." The silence stretched, taut, and oppressive. The only sound was the soft snuffling of the horses in their enclosures. At last Ben spoke, his voice a low rasp. "I know," he admitted. Elara stared, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice barely a breath. "Tell me everything." He hesitated, his gaze breaking from hers, drifting toward the horizon. The sunrise painted the sky with strokes of orange and gold, a stark contrast to the secrets about to be exposed. "It's a sprawling tale, Elara," he confessed, his voice laced with regret. "And one I'm not proud of." He drew a deep breath, as if bracing himself. "But you deserve to know the truth." He looked back, his eyes reflecting a suffering that seemed to span decades. "Before I wore a sheriff's badge," he began, his voice almost inaudible, "I was something else entirely." The secrets were poised to surface, and Elara steeled herself for the tempest to come. The truth, she suspected, would shatter everything. Truth and confessions, a palpable tension choked the small office, the musty tang of aged paper and stale cigarillos doing little to cut through the atmosphere of unspoken charges. Elara held the time-worn chart, its edges softened by years, between them like a primed explosive. The lamplight stuttered, flinging erratic shadows across Ben's leathery features, emphasizing the deep furrows around his eyes, testaments to sleepless nights and a history he desperately sought to evade. "This," she stated, her tone quiet yet resolute, "was secreted away in your desk. Explain it, Ben." He didn't reach out, offer a denial. Instead, his gaze drifted to the grimy street visible through the window, as if seeking a phantom escape. Silence filled the room, broken only by the grandfather clock's measured cadence, each tick a stark reminder of Elara's fading hope. At last he spoke, his voice a harsh rasp, like stone grinding on stone. "It's a map, to a place best left buried." "Buried?" Elara's tone sharpened, despite her resolve to remain composed. "This connects you to the Crimson Riders, Ben, to brigands, to men who have terrorized this land for far too long." He turned then, meeting her gaze, and she glimpsed a flicker she hadn't witnessed before. Not the detached coldness, nor the weary resignation, but a stark, unveiled anguish. "I know them, Elara, more intimately than you could imagine." She advanced a step, her heart drumming against her sternum. "Then enlighten me. Unburden yourself of the truth." He raked a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture that exposed a vulnerability that both stunned and troubled her. "It's a convoluted tale, one that reflects poorly on me. I need to know, Ben. Redemption demands to know." A sigh escaped him, thick with regret. "Before this badge, before redemption, I was someone else entirely, someone I disavow now." He paused, gathering himself, the weight of the past bearing down. "I ran with a different kind of outfit, one with scant regard for the law." Elara drew a sharp breath. It was worse than her darkest imaginings. "You were one of them." "I was adrift," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Enraged, my family eradicated in a raid, I hungered for vengeance, and the riders offered me that conduit." "So, you enlisted?" She pressed, needing to absorb it, to comprehend. He gave a slow nod. "I was young, impetuous. I rationalized it as justice, punishing those who had stolen everything from me. But I was gravely mistaken. I became as debased as they were." He glanced down at his hands, the knuckles scarred and calloused. "I committed acts I lament, actions that continue to haunt my waking hours." Elara held her silence, granting him the space to continue, to unwind the tangled skein of his history. "The riders were merciless," he went on, his voice now infused with grim resolve. "They victimized the defenseless, pilfered from the innocent. I clung to the belief that I was different, that my sole focus was the men who murdered my family, but it was a delusion. I became complicit in their transgressions." He looked up at her again, his gaze imploring understanding. "In time my conscience could no longer bear it. I yearned to escape, but extrication was not so straightforward. They rarely permit such departures." "What course did you take?" Elara queried, her voice a bare thread. "I approached the law," he revealed, a mirthless smile twisting his lips. "I confessed everything I knew, all the riders' designs. I became an informant, a mole within their ranks." "And the map?" "The map, it marks the locations of their hidden stores, their lairs. I was tasked with leading the authorities to them, to dismantle them from within." "Tasked?" Elara tilted her head, brows furrowed. "What intervened?" His expression clouded, the torment in his eyes deepening. "It spiraled out of control. Catastrophically." He drew in a deep breath, as if bracing himself for the recollection. "There was a woman, Sarah, innocence personified, ensared within their world, simply attempting to endure. I swore I would liberate her, vowed to safeguard her." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But I failed her. The riders uncovered my treachery. They were aware of my alliance with the law. They exploited Sarah to transmit a message to me." Elara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a choked cry. She anticipated the grim revelation, could taste it in the atmosphere, suffocating and heavy. "They murdered her," he finished, his voice cracking. "Right before my eyes. They forced me to witness it." He closed his eyes, as if to erase the image, a futile effort. It was seared into his memory, an indelible mark upon his soul. "I endeavored to intervene," he went on, his voice strained. "I fought them, but they were too numerous. They discarded me, left me to fester alongside her body." He reopened his eyes, and Elara grasped the full scope of his ordeal. The guilt, the remorse, the agony, all were laid bare, etched into every line of his face. "I survived," he breathed, his voice a mere whisper. "Barely. The authorities recovered me, pieced me back together. They capitalized on the intelligence I furnished to dismantle the riders, but it was too late for Sarah, too late for everything." He fixed Elara with a pleading gaze. "I came to redemption to outrun my past, to attempt to forge a new existence. I entertained the illusion that I could bury it, obliterate it. But some things remain indelible." Elara stood dumbstruck, the map still clutched in her hand. The man she believed she knew, the stoic, reserved sheriff, had vanished, supplanted by a fractured, haunted individual. At last, she understood the rampart he had erected around himself, the motive for his emotional detachment. He was shielding himself, shielding her, from the darkness that lurked within. The silence descended once more, heavier this time, freighted with the weight of unuttered words and shattered illusions. Elara was at a loss, unsure how to respond to such a soul-rending disclosure. All she was certain of was that the individual before her was not the cold, indifferent lawman she had initially encountered. He was a man who had endured profound suffering, a man who had committed errors, a man desperately seeking absolution. And, despite everything, she couldn't suppress a surge of empathy. Hostage Town. The warm, spiced fragrance of baking bread filled Rosewood Bakery, a comforting embrace against the frigid air. Elara, humming a quiet tune, slid a tray of golden-crusted sourdough from the oven's depths. Morning light poured through the window, momentarily blinding her as it danced on the flour-dusted fabric of her apron. She blinked, turning as the cheerful jingle of the door heralded Martha Abernathy's arrival. Worry creased Martha's brow. "Elara, dear, any chance you've a day-old loaf going cheap? Times are harder than ever, you see." Elara's spirits dipped. The Abernathy farm had been struggling, a situation she suspected Jedediah Stone had engineered. "Of course, Martha. Let me wrap one for my treat." Tears sprang to Martha's eyes. "You're a true gift, Elara. This town needs more like you." As Elara passed over the bread, a different sound shattered the peaceful morning. The earth-shaking cadence of approaching horses. Not the usual cattle drive rumble, but a frantic, desperate stampede. Before Elara could even register alarm, the bakery doors were kicked inward, the frame splintering with the force. 3 masked figures, each sporting the telltale crimson bandanas of the Crimson Riders, burst inside, revolvers glinting. A gruff voice, muffled by fabric, commanded, "Everyone down! This is a raid." Elara's blood turned to ice. Martha gasped, clutching the bread like a lifeline. With ruthless efficiency, the outlaws swept onward, their shadows falling across the street, the sounds of shattering glass and terrified cries carried from the saloon and the general store. Redemption had fallen under siege in the span of mere minutes. Inside the sheriff's office, Ben had been finishing a report on Henlock's missing chickens when chaos erupted. He lunged outside to find his worst nightmare unfolding. Crimson Riders were everywhere, forcing townsfolk into a terrified mass in the center square. Astride a black stallion, Cole Younger surveyed the pandemonium, his face a study in cruel satisfaction. "Ben Holt!" Cole's voice thundered, cutting through the din. "Come on out. Holt, your past has finally caught up." Ben's hand instinctively went to his Colt peacemaker. He desperately scanned the crowd, searching for Elara. He saw her near the edge of the square, her face pale but firm, standing steadfastly beside Martha. Relief surged through him, only to be eclipsed by a sickening dread. Cole's voice boomed again. "We have your town, Holt. Every single soul. Surrender, and they walk free. Refuse, and a foul." "Well, redemption will earn its name in ways you can't imagine." A wave of fear washed over the hostages. Ben felt the weight of their collective hope, their desperate pleas, like a physical blow. He knew Cole's capacity for depravity. Surrender, however, meant facing the hangman's noose, or, worse, a torturous end at the hands of the riders. Sarah Jenkins, the saloon keeper, spoke out, her voice surprisingly firm. "Don't do it, Ben. Don't let them use us." Cole chuckled, a chilling sound that prickled Elara's skin. "Brave words, Sarah, but bravery ain't bulletproof." With a gesture, he had one of his men drag a young boy forward. The child, barely 10, wept openly, his eyes wide, saucers of terror. "Just a taste of things to come, Holt." Cole's voice dripped with menace. "Choose wisely." Ben was paralyzed, torn between the shadows of his past and the promise of his present, between duty and love. He locked eyes with Elara. Her gaze held both a plea and a depth of unwavering strength. She now knew his history, the darkness that clung to him. Yet, she also saw the man he had become, the man who had pledged to safeguard this town. The fate of redemption, and possibly his very soul, hung in the balance. He gazed at the frightened faces of his neighbors Martha, Sarah, Elara. He couldn't let Cole prevail. He refused to allow his past to extinguish the future he was fighting to build. With a heart heavy as lead, Ben started toward the square's center. "All right, Younger," he said, his voice ringing with a grim resolve. "You win." "I'm surrendering." "Ben, no!" Elara cried out in despair. He refused to glance back, fearing that her terror would shatter his resolve. He needed to project strength for her, for redemption. As he neared Cole, the outlaw's lips stretched into a predatory ball. Grin. "Welcome home, Holt," Cole sneered, extending a hand. "It's been far too long," then ignored the gesture. "Let them go, Cole. You've got what you came for." Cole threw back his head and laughed. "Patience, Ben. Patience. First, we settle old scores. After we'll see." With a snap of his fingers, 2 of his men seized Ben, roughly binding his hands. As they hauled him away, Ben risked one last look at Elara. Her face mirrored anguish, but beneath it, he saw the spark of determination. New, even in captivity, redemption was far from broken. Not yet. Standing together, dust devils danced around Ben's boots on Main Street, the sunset bleeding across the buildings in shades of claret and violet. A palpable dread permeated the air, mingling with the acrid tang of burnt timber, a stark reminder of the Crimson Rider's recent savagery. The reassuring heft of his gun belt, adjusted just so, was a scant solace against the looming threat. Cole's arrival was imminent. Inside Rosewood Bakery, Elara attacked the dough, her vigorous kneading a stark percussive contrast to the hushed anxieties swirling through the room. Worry furrowed Martha Abernathy's brow as she cradled a cooling sourdough. "He'll be all right, won't he, Elara?" She breathed, her voice frail. Elara plastered on a smile, her knuckles bone-white as she worked the dough. "Ben's tougher than nails, Martha. He'll pull through." The words felt hollow, yet she needed to project unwavering strength. The townsfolk craved an anchor. Ben's entrance stilled the bakery. Utensils clattered to a halt. The murmur of conversations died. His gaze met Elara's, a silent, loaded exchange passing between them. "Elara, could I have a word with you outside?" She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Offering Martha a brief, comforting squeeze, she followed him into the gathering gloom. "They're coming back," Ben stated, his voice raspy. "Cole won't let this slide." "I know," Elara responded, her tone resolute. "What's the plan?" Ben faltered. "There isn't one." "Not really." "I'm going to face him. Just me." Elara's eyes flared with defiance. "Alone? Have you lost your mind?" "You can't confront them single-handedly, Ben." "I have to. This is about me, not redemption. If I go, maybe they'll leave this place in peace." "That's exactly what they want you to think." Sarah Jenkins, proprietress of the saloon, stepped out of the shadows, her voice laced with steel. "Don't be a damn fool, Ben. You think Cole Younger bargains? He wants blood, and he'll bleed us all dry if you let him." Ben dragged a hand through his hair, fatigue etched deep into his features. "I'm cornered, Sarah. I can't stand by while others get hurt." Elara closed the distance, her hand gently finding his cheek. "You always have a choice, Ben. And so do we. We choose to stand with you." He studied her, his eyes searching, probing the depths of her conviction. "Elara, no, Ben. Listen. I didn't come all this way to watch you sacrifice yourself. You've left that man behind. You're the sheriff of redemption now, and we have faith in you." Sarah chimed in, nodding firmly. "She's right, Ben. We aren't sitting ducks waiting to be slaughtered. We'll fight alongside you." A spark of something akin to hope flickered in Ben's gaze. His eyes shifted between Elara and Sarah, then back again. "Do you understand what this entails, Elara? What I've done?" "I understand you're trying to shield us," she said, her voice both tender and unyielding. "And I understand that you're a man of honor, despite your past, perhaps even because of it." Ben exhaled, a tired sigh escaping his lips, his earlier defiance replaced by a quiet determination. "All right, we fight, but we do it with our wits about us." He addressed Sarah. "Round up everyone you can rely on. Weapons, ammunition, anything they can contribute. Meet me at the church in an hour." Sarah nodded, her typical mirth replaced by a grim resolve. "Consider it done, Sheriff." She vanished back into the saloon, then pivoted back to Elara, his gaze piercing. "This will be perilous." "I wouldn't fault you if you wanted to leave," Elara scoffed. "Leave? Not after all this." "Ben Holt, do you honestly think I scare that easily?" She moved closer, her voice a hushed murmur. "Besides, I have a bakery to run." "And a lawman who requires supervision." A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "A bakery, huh? Planning on baking them to death?" "Perhaps," she said, her eyes dancing with mischief. "Or maybe I'll just dose their coffee." The levity evaporated as swiftly as it had appeared. Ben's expression hardened once again. "We need to fortify the town. The church is the most resilient structure, but it won't hold indefinitely. We need barricades, clear lines of sight." He began to lay out a strategy, his mind already racing, calculating angles and assessing vulnerabilities. Elara listened intently, offering her own input, her keen mind immediately grasping the tactical nuances. The fear hadn't dissipated, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. She would not allow redemption to fall, not while she still drew breath, as they formulated their defenses. The townsfolk started trickling out from their dwellings, their faces set but firm. They carried rifles, shotguns, axes, whatever they could get their hands on. Their movements betrayed a quiet strength, a sense of shared purpose that had been conspicuously absent before. Ben observed them, a flicker of pride illuminating his features. He had tried to distance himself, to shield them from his past, yet they had chosen to stand by him, to defend their home. He wouldn't fail them. Inside the church, the atmosphere crackled with tension, yet focus reigned. Men and women labored together, boarding windows, erecting sandbag fortifications, preparing for the inevitable onslaught. Ben moved amongst them, dispensing instructions, providing encouragement, his presence a calming influence amid the burgeoning chaos. He spotted Elara near the altar, feeding cartridges into a rifle's magazine. He watched her for a moment, admiring her fortitude, her spirit. He knew he was unworthy of her, yet he was profoundly grateful for her presence. He approached, his voice low. "Be careful, Elara." She looked up, their eyes locking. "You too, Ben. Come back to me." He nodded, his throat constricted. Promises were luxuries he couldn't afford, but he vowed to do everything within his power to survive, not just for himself, but for her, for redemption, for the prospect of a future he had long deemed unattainable. As the last vestiges of sunlight slipped below the horizon, engulfing redemption in shadow, Ben stood on the church steps, rifle bass in hand, his gaze fixed on the road leading into town. He knew Cole was coming, and he was prepared. He was no longer simply Sheriff Ben Holt. He was something more, something forged in the crucible of his past, tempered by the devotion of a woman who saw the man lurking beneath the scars. He was a guardian, and he would not yield an inch. Redemption's stand, the opening shot sliced the heavy air. A rupture echoing from the bluff overlooking Main Street. A plume of gunsmoke blossomed against the sun-baked sky as glass exploded from the general store window, showering the porch in glittering shards. The Crimson Rider's arrival was announced. A primal bellow tore from Ben's throat. "Get inside! Take cover!" He steered Martha Abernathy toward the livery, his gaze sweeping across rooftops and shadowy alleys, searching for any sign of the enemy. He'd long braced for this day, the anticipation a constant, bitter taste. Yet, foresight offered little solace as the first bullet zipped past his ear. Elara, her apron still bearing the purr, "Ghost of morning's flower," clutched his arm. "The cellar, Ben. The bakery cellar. It's the safest place." Though tinged with fright, her voice resonated with surprising resolve. She understood redemption's sinews as well as he, perhaps better, having spent recent months charting its hidden strengths, its forgotten crannies. He stalled, wanting to be omnipresent. "I need to be out there." "And you will be," Elara insisted, nudging him toward Sarah Jenkins, who was already shepherding saloon patrons to safety. "But first, ensure everyone's protected." Sarah, a stout figure already cradling a shotgun, nodded gravely. "She's right, Sheriff. We can hold them. Get the women and children underground." Ben conceded, reluctantly. The pull to be everywhere, to shield everyone, tore at him. He snapped orders, his voice cutting through the rising din. "Martha, help Elara. Jenkins, hold the street. I'll be back." With Martha in tow, Elara dashed across the street, evading stray rounds. The bakery's bell chimed wildly as she flung the door open. Inside. Cellar! Now! Her command left no room for debate. She guided a trembling cluster of townsfolk down the creaking stairs, the aroma of yeast and sugar a bizarre contrast to the burgeoning scent of gunpowder. The cellar offered a chill, earth and refuge. Children clung to their mothers, pallid with terror. Elara offered a shaky smile, her own pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew Ben was out there, confronting specters of the past. Back on the street, Ben moved with ruthless efficiency, a resurrected phantom from his former life. Hugging the buildings, full cover, he returned fire with calculated precision, each shot deliberate, a stark difference to the rider's reckless abandon. He spotted Cole then, silhouetted against the fiery sky atop the bank. Distance obscured his features, but Ben recognized that frigid, calculating gaze. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins unleashed her own brand of havoc, a tempest of lead and fury. Having witnessed enough brutality, she wouldn't allow these brigands to tear apart the town she'd helped forge. She felled 2 riders before they even reached the saloon's threshold, her aim unerring. Feeling impotent in the cellar, Elara crept back upstairs. She couldn't remain idle. She had to act. Peeking through a crack in the bakery door, she sought out Ben. She spotted him pinned down near the livery, caught in a storm of gunfire. An idea kindled, born from her familiarity with Redemption's concealed arteries. She knew of the forgotten drainage tunnels beneath Main Street. She could use them to outflank the riders, to provide Ben an opening. She grabbed a hunting rifle from behind the counter, left weeks prior by a traveling salesman. She'd never fired a weapon, but desperation ignited courage. "Martha," she said, her voice tight with resolve. "Watch over everyone. I have to try and help Ben." Martha's eyes widened, filled with alarm. "Elara, no. It's too dangerous." "I must," Elara replied, her gaze unwavering. "This is my home now, too." She slipped out the bakery's rear entrance, moving nimbly through the alleyways. She located the tunnel entrance concealed behind the blacksmith's shop, a gaping chasm in the earth. Taking a steadying breath, she plunged into the gloom. The tunnels were cramped and stifling, the air heavy with the stench of damp earth and decay. She advanced slowly, her hand gliding along the cold, slick walls. She remembered Ben mentioning these conduits, remnants of a system used to drain the town long ago. He had dismissed them as useless relics, but Elara saw their strategic advantage. She emerged from the tunnels behind the bank, near Cole's position. She heard his voice, a low bestial growl, directing his men. She raised the rifle, her hands trembling, and aimed, not at Cole, at the support beam holding his platform aloft. One shot. That's all she required. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the report deafening in the confined space. The support beam splintered, groaning under the sudden weight and stress. The platform tilted, sending Cole tumbling. The disruption offered Ben his chance. He surged forward, his gun spitting fire. He moved with newfound speed and ferocity, a whirlwind of rage and bullets. Cole, scrambling up, met Ben's onslaught head-on. The men collided in a savage, desperate ballet, a dance of death long in the making. Guns were abandoned, replaced by fists and blades. They grappled and clawed, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. Horror seized Elara, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run to Ben, to assist him, but knew she would only impede him. All she could do was observe and pray. The struggle seemed unending. But at last, Ben gained the advantage. He pinned Cole, his knee pressing into his chest, poised to deliver the final blow. Yet, he hesitated. He stared down at Cole's face, a mask of hate and defeat. And Elara detected something flicker within Ben's eyes, an emotion previously unseen. A spark of pity. He lowered his fist. "It's over, Cole," he said, his voice rasping. "It's been over for years." Cole spat in his face. "It'll never be over, Holt. You'll always be one of us." Then wiped the spittle away, his expression grim. "No," he refuted. "I'm not." He rose, turning from Cole. He walked toward Elara, his eyes searching for hers. He was smeared with blood and earth, his face bruised and battered, but to Elara, he had never appeared more magnificent. The remaining Crimson Riders, witnessing their leader's downfall, began to flee. The shootout concluded. Redemption had endured. Ben reached Elara, his hand gently caressing her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Elara nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm all right," she responded. "Are you?" He surveyed the town, the faces of those he had vowed to protect. He saw fear and weariness, but also something new, respect, possibly even affection. "Yeah," he conceded, a subtle smile gracing his lips. "I think I am." But Elara sensed, gazing into his eyes, that redemption's true battle had only just begun. The scars of the past were deep, and the journey to absolution would be fraught with difficulty. But as long as they remained together, they would confront it as one. They would rebuild. They would discover redemption. Forgiveness and hope dust devils danced around Elara's boots, a visible echo of the turmoil within her. Then remained a statue of fury, his revolver leveled at Cole, the Crimson Rider, who spat crimson-tinged contempt onto the parched earth. Cole's own weapon rested just beyond his reach, a casualty of their brutal exchange. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick with the reek of burnt powder and simmering dread. Yet, it was Elara who broke the stalemate, not toward Ben, but toward his captive. Kneeling beside Cole, she disregarded his pained grunt and swiftly extracted a diminutive derringer from his boot. The action, so unexpected, briefly diffused the charged atmosphere. Rising, she offered the weapon to Ben, handle first. "Enough, Ben," she stated, her voice resolute despite the tremor in her grip. "He's finished." Ben didn't yield. His face, etched with the harsh lines of time and sorrow, remained impassive. "He deserves the rope, Elara, for everything he's done." "Perhaps," she conceded, her gaze unwavering. "But that decision doesn't belong to you right now. Not in this manner." She indicated the townsfolk cautiously emerging from their dwellings, their faces a study in mingled relief and unease. "They're scrutinizing you, Ben. They need to witness more than just a lawman exacting vengeance." Cole coughed, a ragged, congested sound. "Just get it over with, Holt," he croaked. "Save everyone the aggravation." Ben's jaw clenched. Elara discerned the inner conflict warring within him, the battle between the man he was and the man he yearned to become. She moved closer, laying a hand on his forearm. Beneath the worn leather of his jacket, his muscles were taut cords. "Ben," she implored, her voice a hushed entreaty, "demonstrate to them, demonstrate to yourself, that you've moved beyond that darkness." His gaze met hers then, and the usual guarded chill in his eyes flickered with a startling, almost agonizing vulnerability. He saw the steadfast conviction in her expression, the unwavering faith she held in him, even amidst his own self-doubt. He glimpsed the hope she embodied, a fragile ember in the encroaching shadows. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his weapon. The crisp click of the hammer's release punctuated the sudden hush. He reholstered the gun. "Get him seen to," he directed, his voice gravelly but controlled. He motioned to a few of the townsfolk who hesitated, then complied at his bidding. "Then lock him away. He'll answer for his crimes in court." A collective exhalation of relief rippled through the onlookers. Even those who had clamored for Cole's execution seemed to grasp the significance of Ben's choice. It represented a turning of the tide, a divergence from the brutal customs of the past towards something more humane. Cole was dragged away, still obstinate, his fight extinguished. The Crimson Riders, scattered and routed, were corralled and relieved of their arms. The immediate danger had passed, yet the weight of its aftermath pressed heavily upon the scene. Ben stood motionless, observing the unfolding events, his features inscrutable. Elara remained at his side, offering silent solace. Once the last of the prisoners had been secured, he finally turned to her. "Why?" he asked, his voice almost inaudible. "Why did you intervene?" "Because I see who you are, Ben Holt," she replied quietly, cradling his cheek in her palm. "And that man is better than Cole could ever hope to be." He winced at her touch, yet didn't recoil. "Don't idealize me, Elara. I'll only disappoint you." "Then I'll be there to catch you," she assured him, her eyes glistening with suppressed tears. "Every single time." He closed his eyes, a wave of emotion surging through him. He had spent an eternity erecting barricades, pushing away companionship, convinced of his own unworthiness. Yet Elara had patiently dismantled those barriers, brick by brick, until he stood exposed, fragile and optimistic. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elara smiled, a dazzling, transformative smile that banished the gloom clinging to his spirit. "Probably not," she teased. "But you're stuck with me, regardless." He drew her close, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of flower and cinnamon that permeated her clothes, a comforting fragrance evocative of warmth, hearth, and a life he had long believed unattainable. "Thank you," he murmured. She held him firmly, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The preceding weeks had been a tempest of anxiety and uncertainty, but in that instant, amidst the debris of their struggle, she felt a tranquility she hadn't realized was possible. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, splashing the sky with vibrant hues of apricot and amethyst, they strolled hand in hand toward the town's perimeter. They discovered a gentle knoll overlooking the valley, a sanctuary where the wind whispered secrets and the stars blazed brightly. They sat in quiet companionship for a long time, observing the sunset. A chill entered the air, and Elara shivered slightly, then removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "Elara," he began, his voice laced with hesitation. "About what I said earlier about not wanting you here." She touched a finger to his lips, silencing him. "I understood your reasoning, Ben. You were afraid. But I'm not leaving, unless you want me to." He clasped her hand in his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I want you to stay," he said, his voice sure. "I want sure." "You to stay. Forever." He turned to face her, his eyes probing hers. "I love you, Elara Rosewood," he confessed, the words stark and heartfelt. "More than I ever imagined possible." Tears cascaded down her cheeks, yet she was smiling. "I love you too, Ben Holt," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "More than words can possibly convey." He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, soul-stirring kiss, that sealed their connection. A pledge of a shared tomorrow, a future forged on forgiveness, hope, and abiding affection. As the sun's last light faded, casting elongated shadows across the valley, they stood together, hand in hand, watching the first stars emerge in the deepening indigo sky. Redemption was still a town scarred by its history, but in that moment, standing beside the man she loved, Elara knew that transformation was within reach. Their journey was far from its conclusion, but they would confront it together, side by side, poised to create a new existence, a new destiny, in the heart of redemption. Rosewood Bakery would open its doors again, imbuing the air with something more than just the aroma of bread, the subtle, pervasive fragrance of hope.